As you are aware, the continent has been facing a lot of global challenges. We have the 3 C's: climate, conflicts, and also COVID. The African Development Bank Group's African Economic Outlook for this year 2023 focused on mobilizing private sector financing for climate and green growth in Africa. The report that focuses on 3 themes. 1, on Africa's performance and outlook in the short and medium term. 2, mobilizing private sector financing for climate and green growth in Africa. And then finally, how to harness natural capital for climate and green growth in Africa.
One of the key findings from Chapter 1 of this year's African Economic Outlook is that African economy remains resilient despite multiple and overlapping shocks. The growth this year is estimated at 3.8%, which is higher than the 2.4% of the global growth. And despite these multiple and overlapping shocks, the growth outlook on the continent is estimated to be 4% in 2023 and to accelerate to 4.2% in 2024. 5 of the 6 pre-pandemic top-performing economies are set to back to the world 10 fastest growing economy. The outturn in 2022 and the medium-term outlook vary across regions and economic structure. For instance, North Africa is projected to grow by 4.5% over the period 2023-2024 and from 4.1%. East Africa is also projected to grow by 5.5% from 4.4%. And in terms of economic structure, we also have non-intensive economy, which are mostly more diversified economies. They are projected to grow by 5% over the period 2023 and to accelerate to 5.6% in 2024. We have a fiscal deficit, which is narrowing to 4% this year from 4.9% last year. Over the medium to long term, countries need to scale up domestic resource mobilization to restore fiscal sustainability. Countries also need to implement industrial strategic policies to accelerate economic diversification on the continent. Countries also need to increase regional trade to build resilience against the shocks that we are seeing now. There is also a need to reform the international financial and debt architecture to reduce the cost of financing and so to reduce also debt resolution costs on the continent.
Despite the urgency to act on climate change, despite all political commitment by African countries on green growth, and despite the African countries' very rich natural resources, countries have not done well in terms of promoting green growth. And we have shown in the report that African countries are the least performing countries compared to the rest of the world when it comes to the promotion of green growth. The second result that we have found in the report is that African countries need really to attract private sector because the scale of resources that is needed for climate action and green growth is so high that public resources alone cannot bear all the costs. We have shown that African countries need between 2.6 trillion and 2.8 trillion US dollars between 2020 and 2030 in order to address their climate finance needs because we have so many barriers. And in the chapter, we have subdivided them into 2 categories. You have demand-side barriers and then you have supply-side barriers. The first one is that we have very little, even lack of implementation of green growth strategy. Only few countries really have green growth strategy. Another key barriers on the demand side is that we have very weak regulatory structure and public institutions. We have a lack of sizable project pipelines in many African countries. And one of the key reasons that we have very low human, technical, and institutional capacity of many African countries. And of course, in many countries, we have very high project costs. And also we have the problem of high debts in many countries and very little access to international markets. And on the supply side, you also have barriers. So those are the barriers that are related to the private sector itself. And one of them is that African countries are perceived as a very risky market. So that leads to high cost of capital. We have very poor and sometimes subjective rating of African countries, and this again leads to very high cost of borrowing. Finally, international investors, they have very little experience on African market, so they base their decision on information that's outdated or which is not sometimes correct. The policy recommendation we are proposing, but the first one is African government. They need to develop, they need to communicate, and they need to cost their green growth and long-term strategy. Second one, they need to improve their accountability and governance structure. We have very innovative financing instruments, but African countries are not really leveraging those instruments. They need to develop their financial and banking system, because without that, they will not attract private sector investment. They also need to close the gap in terms of data. So if they can improve access to information about the full potential of their market, then maybe that can close the asymmetric information that we are still seeing in many African countries. Multilateral development banks, they need to support African countries with debt issues problem, and for that they need to give them more concessional debt. In the long term, they need to work on their capital adequacy ratio. And the last part is about developed countries. Developed countries are the main shareholders of many of these multilateral development banks. So they need to give them broader and more ambitious mandates.
Basically, what that chapter tries to do is to bring the opportunities in natural capital and how natural capital can indeed finance climate change actions and green growth in Africa, particularly the green transitions. In doing that, we took a quick look at the contribution of natural resources to GDP of Africa. It was estimated at 60%, which means African countries are heavily reliant on natural resources in generating their gross domestic product. What this intrinsically also means is that the majority of African people, their livelihoods, their economies, really depending on nature. Our analysis found out that Africa's natural capital was estimated at $6.2 trillion as at 2018. And then this estimate also does not include some unmeasured natural capital like sunlight, biodiversity, and water resources like oceans, for example. Challenges remain. African countries are unable to actually measure their natural capital, because what we find, for example, the data gaps is a typical example to tell us where the problems are. Policymakers in Africa also do not fully appreciate the role of natural capital in economic development. So we need to do a lot of awareness raising in that aspect to ensure that it becomes mainstream in Africa's policy frameworks. Another key challenge is illicit financial flows. The study also exposed the little amount of resources or revenue that Africa is able to get from its natural resources has left Africa through illicit financial flows to the tune of $1 trillion within the last 50 years. The opportunities exist. There are certain international agreements that are related to both boosting climate finance and also nature-based solutions that African countries can compel donor countries to pledge the commitment that they've made. For example, under the Global Biodiversity Framework, where an estimated $20 billion is expected to be mobilized by 2025 and $30 billion by 2030. If you look at the hydrogen market, hydrogen is a key natural resource that occurs naturally. There's an opportunity for green hydrogen, for example, to be harnessed. There's also opportunity for critical green minerals. The fourth industrial revolution is going to increase the demand of critical minerals that will be used for robotics, for example. Africa's forest cover has been estimated to be 637 million hectares. What this means, if we can monetize Africa's forests, particularly the Congo Basin, it will provide a new financing framework for Central African countries to be able to pitch that natural capital to be able to also integrate their sovereign credit risk, and then they will be able to increase their credit worthiness, and then it can also attract further private financing. There are some key policy recommendations that ranges from what the government needs to do, what the bank like AFDB needs to do, and also what the international community needs to do. First of all, there's need for coordination. There's need for African countries to come together, agree on a framework to be able to adequately measure their natural capital wealth. There's also the need to improve the quality of our data collection. In the report, we also promoted that African countries should use part of their natural resource rent to finance quality data collection for natural capital, because that is the only way for them to take ownership when they invest their own resources that was also gotten from revenues from natural resources.
The natural capital potential in Africa is humongous, but you don't eat potentials. Like the president of the African Development Bank always says, no one smokes gas or drinks crude oil. So no matter how huge the potentials we have in green minerals, if we don't transform those green minerals to become high-value products, we will continue to receive low-value incomes from it. And my own personal wish is that Africa does not repeat the development models we have had in other industrial revolutions, where we were the source of raw materials, source of human capital, source of natural capital to drive development elsewhere, but not in Africa.